Some dogs don't forget their last mission. They just wait for the right person to finish it. The shelter sat at the edge of town where the road turned to gravel and the wind carried the smell of pine and old rain. A quiet place most people passed without noticing. But Ethan Cole had learned long ago that the quiet places were where things either healed or stayed buried. At 40 years old, with a worn jacket and a white cane tapping softly against the concrete, he stepped inside, not looking for anything in particular. Just a place to sit where no one expected him to see more than he could. But the moment the heavy door shut behind him, the air shifted, subtle but real, like the feeling before a storm you can't quite hear yet. And somewhere deeper in the building, a low, controlled breath broke the silence. They told him about the dog before he even asked. A retired police K9 named Rex, 6 years old, too aggressive, too unpredictable, not safe for adoption. The kind of animal people spoke about in lowered voices. But Ethan didn't react the way they expected. He simply nodded once, as if he had heard stories like that before, because he had, about men, about war, about things that weren't broken, just misunderstood. The handler hesitated before leading him down the narrow hallway, boots echoing softly against the floor, past cages filled with nervous movement and restless sounds, until they reached the last enclosure at the end, separated, reinforced, quiet. "He doesn't like strangers," the handler said, voice tight, but Ethan had already stopped walking, his head tilting slightly, listening, not to the warning but to something else, something beneath it. Rex stood inside the enclosure, muscles still, eyes locked forward, a dog trained to react faster than thought. Yet he didn't bark, didn't lunge, didn't even move as Ethan stepped closer, the tapping of the cane slowing, then stopping altogether. For a long second, nothing happened, just two beings standing in the same space. One who couldn't see, and one who saw too much. Then, almost imperceptibly, the dog's posture shifted, tension easing, not into weakness, but into something quieter, something older, like recognition. The handler exhaled under his breath, confused, but Ethan only crouched slightly, resting his hand against his knee, not reaching out yet, just waiting, the way you wait for a sound to return in an empty room. Rex took one step forward, then another, slow, deliberate, until he stood inches from the barrier, his breath steady, his ears no longer sharp with alert but angled, listening. Ethan smiled faintly, the kind of smile that didn't come from sight, but from knowing, and for the first time in a long while, the silence between two strangers didn't feel empty. It felt like the beginning of something neither of them fully understood yet, because sometimes the ones who cannot see are the only ones who truly notice when something is trying to be found. The handler did not understand what he was seeing, because he had watched Rex snap at trained officers, had seen the dog reject command after command. Yet now the animal stood still, breathing slow, as if something in front of him had rewritten the rules he had lived by. Ethan remained quiet, his head slightly tilted, listening not just to the dog but to the space between them, the faint shift of paws against concrete, the rhythm of breath that carried more meaning than words ever could. And, after a moment, he lowered himself further, resting one knee on the cold floor, placing his hand gently against the barrier, not forcing contact, just offering presence. Rex moved closer, his nose nearing the glass, not touching, just hovering there as if measuring something invisible, and for a brief second, the world inside that shelter narrowed to a single, fragile balance. A line between fear and trust that could have broken at any movement, but it did not. Instead it held, steady and quiet. "That is not normal," the handler whispered, but Ethan only smiled faintly because normal had never explained the things that mattered most. The paperwork was signed before the staff could fully argue against it, warnings repeated, disclaimers read out loud. But Ethan listened the way he always did, absorbing tone instead of words, and somewhere beneath the concern, he heard something else, relief, as if even they knew. The dog did not belong behind steel forever. By late afternoon, the sky had turned a pale gray, stretching low over the road as Ethan stepped outside with Rex walking beside him. Not pulling, not resisting, just matching his pace with a quiet precision that felt less like obedience and more like understanding. The gravel crunched under their feet. each step measured, the leash loose in Ethan's hand. And for the first mile, neither of them made a sound. Not a bark, not a command, just the steady rhythm of movement. Two lives adjusting to the same direction. His small cabin sat just under 2 miles from the shelter, tucked between a line of old pine trees and a narrow creek that carried water year-round, the kind of place where silence settled deep into the walls. And when they reached it, Ethan paused at the door, hand resting on the worn wood, listening, because he had learned that every place had its own voice if you stood still long enough. Inside, the air was cool and still, the faint scent of cedar and old fabric lingering in the corners, and Rex stepped in cautiously, nails clicking softly against the floorboards, his body alert but not tense, as if mapping the space in ways Ethan could not see. For a while, everything remained calm, almost too calm, until night settled in and the world outside faded into a quiet hum of wind through trees, and that was when Rex changed, not with noise, but with movement, pacing slowly across the room, then stopping near the far wall, his head lowering, ears shifting, listening to something deep beneath the floor, something steady, something repeating. Ethan sat still in his chair, hands resting on his knees, his breathing slowing as he focused, because there was, faint but real, a soft, rhythmic tapping, spaced evenly apart, not random, not natural, a pattern. Rex tapped the floor once with his paw, then again, matching the rhythm exactly, and Ethan felt a familiar tension settle into his chest. Not fear, but recognition. Because it sounded like something he had not heard in years, something from a different life, a coded signal, precise and deliberate. And, as the sound continued beneath them, steady as a hidden heartbeat, he understood one thing with absolute certainty. The dog had not brought him here by chance. The sound did not stop, and that was what unsettled him most. Not its presence, but its precision, a steady interval that refused to drift, as if whatever lay beneath the cabin floor was not simply shifting or settling, but communicating. Ethan leaned forward slightly, his fingers pressing against the wood beside his boots, feeling for vibration. And there it was again, faint but undeniable, a soft pulse that traveled through the grain like a quiet echo. And beside him Rex mirrored the moment, lowering his body, one paw resting firmly against the exact spot where the rhythm felt strongest, his ears angled not outward toward the night, but downward, listening into the earth itself. Ethan exhaled slowly, counting under his breath the way he had years ago, measuring distance, timing signals, learning to trust patterns when sight failed him even then, and when the next pulse came, he felt it before he finished the count. Exact, deliberate, intentional. This was not random, and it was not new. Rex shifted again, this time letting out a low sound, not a growl, not a warning, but something quieter, almost urging, and then he tapped the floor twice, paused, and tapped once more, repeating it with careful consistency, as if trying to translate something that had been waiting too long to be heard. Ethan reached out, placing his hand gently on the dog's shoulder, feeling the tension there, not fear but focus, the kind that came from training, from purpose, from a task that had never been completed. "You remember something," Ethan murmured softly, not expecting an answer, but sensing one anyway, because memory did not always belong to words. Sometimes it lived in instinct, in repetition, in the body remembering what the mind had tried to leave behind. He shifted his weight and stood slowly, moving toward the wall where the sound seemed to travel strongest, his hand sliding along the surface, tracing the seams between boards, and after a moment, his fingers paused over a slight imperfection, a line too straight to be natural, too clean to be where, something placed there, rather than formed. Rex stepped closer immediately, his nose pressing near Ethan's hand, his breathing quickening just slightly, and then he did it again, 3 taps, steady and clear. Ethan felt a quiet certainty settle into him, the kind that did not come from sight, but from alignment, from 2 separate senses arriving at the same truth. He knelt down carefully and pressed against the board, testing its resistance, and it shifted, just barely, enough to confirm what he already knew there. was something beneath them. Outside, the wind moved through the trees, carrying a low whisper across the cabin. But inside, the air felt different now, heavier, as if the space itself had been waiting for this moment, for someone to notice, to listen, to respond. Ethan sat back on his heels, his hands still resting on the wood, his mind moving through possibilities, not fear, not danger, but purpose, because whatever had been hidden here had not been meant to stay hidden forever, only until the right person arrived. Rex lowered himself beside him, his body finally still, as if the signal had been received, as if the first step of something long unfinished had finally begun. And in that quiet room, with nothing but the sound beneath the floor and the steady breath of the dog beside him, Ethan understood something simple and profound. Sometimes the world does not need to be seen to be uncovered. It only needs someone willing to listen long enough for the truth to reveal where it has been waiting. The board did not open easily, as if time itself had pressed it down, sealing whatever lay beneath with years of silence and forgotten purpose. But Ethan did not rush. He had learned long ago that forcing something hidden often made it retreat further. So instead he traced the edges again, feeling the grain, the slight looseness at one corner, and then he shifted his weight and applied steady pressure. Not strength, just patience. Beside him, Rex remained close, his body low, eyes fixed on the exact spot. And when the wood finally gave a fraction of an inch, the dog exhaled sharply, as if a door had opened not just in the floor, but in something he had been holding onto for a very long time. The sound beneath them paused, just for a second, then resumed, softer now, almost expectant. Ethan slid his fingers into the narrow gap and lifted carefully, the board rising with a quiet creak that seemed louder than it should have been, echoing in the stillness of the cabin. And beneath it, there was darkness, not empty, but layered, the kind of darkness that holds space rather than absence. A faint draft rose from below, cool and dry, carrying a scent that was not decay, not neglect, but something preserved, something kept. Rex leaned forward immediately, nose dipping toward the opening, his breathing changing, quicker, more focused, and then he let out a single low sound. Not warning, not fear, but recognition. Ethan tilted his head, listening again, and now the rhythm was clearer, not just a tapping, but a sequence, uneven in a way that made sense, like a message broken into parts. And his chest tightened slightly as memory brushed against him, because he knew this kind of pattern had followed signals like this through places where silence meant survival. He reached down slowly, his hand finding the edge of what felt like a ladder, metal, cold, steady, and he paused there, not from hesitation, but from understanding that whatever waited below was not meant to be discovered by accident. Outside, the wind moved again, brushing against the cabin walls in long, soft strokes, but inside, everything felt drawn toward that opening, as if the room itself had been holding its breath. Rex stepped closer to Ethan's side, pressing gently against his leg, a grounding presence. And for the first time since the sound began, the dog did not move ahead. He waited, as if this next step belonged to the man, not to him. Ethan nodded faintly, though no one could see it, and placed one hand firmly on the ladder, testing its strength, then another, lowering himself carefully, each movement measured, each breath steady, counting the space between rungs, the distance, from floor to whatever lay beneath. The air grew cooler as he descended, the sound shifting slightly, no longer traveling through wood, but through open space, clearer now, closer, and when his boots finally touched the ground below, he stood still for a moment, letting the silence settle around him, because silence always revealed more after movement stopped. Above, Rex remained at the opening, his silhouette unmoving, guarding the threshold, and below, in the dim, hidden space beneath the cabin no one had thought twice about. Ethan listened, and the pattern continued, patient, deliberate, as if it had been waiting not just to be heard, but to be understood by someone who knew how to listen beyond what could be seen. The space beneath the cabin was not large, but it carried a weight that made it feel deeper than it was, as if time had settled here in layers instead of passing through. and Ethan stood still for several seconds, allowing his senses to adjust, not to sight but to presence, to the way sound moved differently in enclosed spaces, to the faint shift of air that told him where walls stood and where space opened. The rhythmic tapping continued, clearer now, echoing softly against what felt like metal somewhere ahead, and he took a slow step forward, boots brushing against a surface that was not dirt, not quite wood either, but something smoother, more deliberate, like flooring placed with intention. Above him, he could hear Rex reposition slightly, a soft scrape of paws at the opening. Then stillness again, the dog holding his place like a silent sentinel, and for a moment Ethan felt a quiet reassurance in that. Not because he needed protection, but because he understood that whatever lay here, they were facing it together. He extended one hand outward, fingertips grazing the air until they met a vertical surface, cool and firm, and he followed it slowly, mapping the boundary, feeling seams, edges, the subtle language of structure, until his fingers brushed against something different, a small protrusion, circular, worn smooth, like a button or a dial. The tapping paused the instant his hand touched it. The silence that followed, heavier than the sound itself had been, and Ethan felt his breath catch slightly, not from fear, but from recognition, because silence like that did not happen by accident. It responded. He hesitated only briefly before pressing. Gently, not forcing, just acknowledging. And somewhere in the darkness, a soft click answered him, followed by a low hum that seemed to rise from the walls themselves, steady and controlled. A faint vibration traveled through the floor, then stopped, replaced by something new, a soft mechanical shift, as if a long-dormant system had just awakened to the presence of someone who knew how to listen. Above, Rex let out a quiet sound, not alarm, not distress, but confirmation, and Ethan nodded, slightly, grounding himself in that familiar connection, because the dog had not led him here without reason. The air changed again, warmer now by just a few degrees, carrying a faint scent of metal and something else, something older, like paper preserved in sealed spaces, and Ethan moved forward carefully, each step measured, guided not by sight, but by the subtle cues that shaped the world in ways most people never noticed. Then his boot struck something lightly, and he knelt down, reaching out until his fingers found it, a rectangular object resting on a flat surface, solid, deliberate. And when he lifted it, he felt the edges, the corners, the texture, a box, not large, but significant, the kind of object that was meant to be found, not stumbled upon. The silence around him held steady, no longer empty, but waiting, and Ethan understood then that this place had not been hiding from the world. It had been waiting for the right moment, the right signal, the right person, and as he held the box in his hands, with the quiet presence of the dog above and the stillness of the hidden room around him, one thought settled into place with quiet certainty. Some missions do not end when they are forgotten. They end when someone finally listens closely enough to hear them begin again. The box felt heavier than its size suggested, not in weight alone, but in intention, as if everything about it had been designed to endure time, to remain exactly where it was until the moment it would finally be held again, and Ethan ran his fingers slowly across its surface, tracing edges worn smooth, a faint seam along the lid, and something else, a marking, subtle but deliberate, pressed into the material like a signature left for someone who knew how to find it. Above, the faint shift of Rex's movement echoed softly through the opening, followed by a single, quiet tap of his paw against the floor, not urgent, not warning, but steady, grounding, reminding Ethan that he was not alone in this hidden space. He exhaled slowly and adjusted his grip, placing the box carefully on the flat surface in front of him, his hands moving with the same patience he had carried through years of rebuilding things others had left behind. And as his fingers found the seam again, he paused, not from hesitation, but from respect, because whatever this was, it had waited long enough. The silence around him seemed to deepen, as if even the air had drawn back, allowing the moment to settle fully before continuing, and then with a gentle motion, he lifted the lid. There was no sudden sound, no dramatic shift, only a quiet release, like something long held finally letting go, and inside his fingers met paper first, thick and preserved, edges crisp despite the years, followed by something cooler, metallic, resting beneath it. He lifted the top layer carefully, feeling the weight of what seemed like documents, pages layered together. And though he could not see them, he could sense their order, their care, as if they had been placed not just to be stored, but to be understood. Beneath them, his hand brushed against a small device, smooth and compact, with a surface that responded faintly to his touch, a low vibration humming briefly before settling into stillness again. And the moment his fingers rested on it, the pattern he had been hearing changed, shifting from beneath the floor to within the object itself. The same rhythm, now closer, clearer, as if the signal had found its destination. Ethan inhaled sharply, recognition settling deeper, because this was not just something left behind. It was something still active, still waiting, and he realized then that the tapping had never been random. It had been guiding, leading him step by step until he reached the source. Above him, Rex let out a low breath, then another, and the sound of his body settling near the opening carried a quiet sense of completion, like a task finally fulfilled, yet not entirely finished. Ethan gathered the contents carefully, holding the box close. And for a moment he stood there in the dim, unseen space, listening again, but now the silence felt different, no longer waiting, but opening, as if whatever had been hidden here was ready to be carried forward. He turned toward the ladder slowly, one hand steady on the metal rung, the other securing the box. And as he began to climb, each step, measured and certain, one thought moved quietly through him, steady as the rhythm he had followed. Some truths are not buried to be lost. They are buried to make sure only the right person finds them. And now, for the first time, he understood that Rex had not just remembered this place. He had been protecting it, waiting for the moment when someone who could not see would finally be able to understand what others had overlooked. The moment Ethan's hands reached the top of the ladder, the air shifted again, warmer, familiar, carrying the faint scent of cedar and night wind. And Rex was there instantly, stepping close, pressing his body gently against Ethan's side, as if confirming that he had returned, that whatever had been below had not taken him somewhere unreachable. Ethan placed the box carefully on the wooden floor beside the opening, his movements slow and deliberate, and for a brief moment, neither of them moved. The silence between them no longer tense, but settled, like something long unsettled had finally found its place. Rex circled once, then lowered himself near the exposed opening, his eyes fixed on it, not with urgency anymore, but with quiet watchfulness, as if the task had shifted from finding to guarding. Ethan knelt beside the box again, running his fingers over its contents, feeling the layered paper, the small device still faintly warm in his hand, and as he held it, the subtle vibration returned, softer now, like a signal that had completed its path and no longer needed to call out as loudly. He tilted his head slightly, listening not just to the device, but to the space around him, to the absence of the earlier tapping beneath the floor, and that absence told him more than any sound could have, because whatever had been waiting below was no longer trying to be heard. It had been found. He shifted his attention back to the papers, carefully separating them, his fingertips tracing the edges, the thickness, the impressions pressed into the surface, and though he could not see the words, he could feel the care in how they had been arranged, not scattered, not forgotten, but preserved, as if someone had believed they would matter one day. Rex lifted, his head slightly, ears turning toward Ethan as if responding not to sound, but to intention, and then the dog moved closer, placing one paw gently against Ethan's knee. A steady, grounding touch that carried more reassurance than any voice. Ethan smiled faintly, his expression softening in a way that had not come easily in years, because in that quiet moment, he understood something deeper than the discovery itself. He understood why the dog had chosen him. Not because he was strong, not because he could see what others missed, but because he could listen without needing proof, could trust a signal without questioning its origin. Outside, the wind moved through the trees again, softer now, the kind of sound that followed after something had shifted in the world. and inside the cabin, the air felt lighter, as if the space itself had been holding on to something it was finally able to release. Ethan gathered the papers carefully, keeping them aligned, then held the device once more, his fingers resting on its surface as the faint vibration faded into stillness. And in that stillness, he felt a quiet certainty settle into place, not about what the box contained, but about what it meant, because whatever story had been left here had not ended. It had only paused, waiting for someone who could carry it forward without needing to see it first. Rex lowered himself beside him again, his breathing slow, his posture relaxed for the first time since they had arrived, and as Ethan sat there in the quiet glow of the cabin, with the hidden space now open behind him and the weight of the box resting in his hands, one truth became clear in a way that did not need explanation. Sometimes, the most dangerous things are not the ones that threaten harm, but the ones that guard something too important to be forgotten. And sometimes, the ones who seem broken are the only ones trusted to finally understand why. The night settled deeper around the cabin, but inside, something had shifted in a way that made the darkness feel less like an absence and more like a presence waiting to be understood, and Ethan sat quietly with the box in front of him, his fingers moving slowly across the top sheet once more, tracing the faint impressions pressed into the paper. And this time, instead of stopping at the edges, he followed the indentations themselves, the subtle grooves left behind by ink long dried, letting his fingertips read what his eyes could not. At first, it was only fragments, uneven pressure, the rise and fall of letters shaped by a steady hand, but then patterns began to form, familiar spacing, the structure of sentences, and though he could not hear the words, he could feel their intention, their order, as if the message had been written not just to be seen, but to be found in another way. Rex shifted beside him, lifting his head slightly, his ears angled toward Ethan, not toward the outside world, but toward the quiet work unfolding in the room. And then the dog moved closer, placing his chin gently against Ethan's leg, a silent acknowledgement that whatever this was, they were moving through it together. Ethan adjusted his grip on the paper, sliding to the next layer, and as his fingers moved, something small slipped free, landing softly against the wooden floor with a faint, controlled sound, and he paused, turning his head toward it, listening, mapping its position, before reaching down to retrieve it. It was thinner, lighter, separate piece, and when he lifted it, his fingers immediately recognized the difference, a card, stiffer than the pages above, with edges that had not worn down the same way, as if it had been placed last, deliberately, as a final marker. He traced its surface slowly, and there, pressed deeper than the rest, was a pattern unlike the others, not words, but numbers, evenly spaced, intentional, and beneath them, a single line, drawn with precision. His breath slowed as recognition settled in again, because this was not just a message, it was direction, coordinates perhaps, or a sequence meant to be followed, something that extended beyond the cabin, beyond the hidden space below. The faint memory of the rhythmic tapping returned to him. Not a sound now, but a structure, the same spacing, the same deliberate intervals. And suddenly the pieces aligned in a way that felt less like discovery and more like completion. Above the quiet of the room, the wind brushed softly against the cabin walls, and for a brief moment, the sound carried a low, almost distant hum, like an echo of the signal that had led him here, fading now that it had served its purpose. Rex lifted his head again, his posture calm, no longer searching, no longer listening for something hidden, because whatever had needed to be found was now in Ethan's hands. Ethan held the card carefully, his fingers resting on the numbers, and he felt a quiet certainty settle into him. Not about where it would lead, but about why it had been left, because this had never been just about uncovering something buried. It had been about continuing something unfinished. He leaned back slightly, the wood of the cabin floor steady beneath him, the open space behind him no longer calling out, and for the first time since the sound had begun, there was no urgency, only direction. Rex lowered himself beside him once more, his breathing slow and even. The kind of calm that came after purpose had been fulfilled. And as Ethan sat there in the stillness, holding the final piece of something that had waited longer than either of them could measure, one thought moved quietly through him, clear and unwavering. Some truths are not meant to stay hidden. They're meant to be followed, step by step, by those who are willing to trust what they cannot see until it leads them exactly where they are meant to be. Morning arrived slowly, not with brightness, but with a quiet shift in the air, the kind that carried a sense of continuation rather than beginning. And Ethan sat near the window with the small card resting between his fingers, its edges now familiar. Its numbers no longer just patterns, but direction waiting to be followed. Rex stirred beside him, lifting his head as the first breeze moved through the trees outside, his ears adjusting not with urgency, but with calm awareness, as if the world had returned to its natural rhythm now that something long unsettled had found its place. Ethan stood carefully, folding the papers back into the box with deliberate care, placing the device last, his hand lingering on it for a moment as if acknowledging the role it had played, not as a machine, but as a voice that had waited to be heard. He secured the lid gently and set the box near the door, not hidden, not stored away, but ready, because whatever came next was not meant to remain inside the cabin. Outside, the ground stretched quietly beneath a pale sky, the path leading away from the cabin winding through the trees like a line drawn long before he ever arrived. And as Ethan stepped forward, his cane touching the earth with soft, measured taps, Rex moved beside him without command, his pace steady, his presence certain, no longer searching, but guiding. The air carried a faint clarity, the kind that followed after something unseen had shifted into alignment. And for a while, neither of them rushed, each step deliberate, each movement grounded in a direction that did not need to be questioned. Ethan reached in his pocket, his fingers brushing the card again, feeling the numbers pressed into its surface, and though he could not see them, he no longer needed to, because he understood that they were not just coordinates on a map. They were part of a path that had already begun the moment Rex chose to trust him. The wind moved softly through the branches above, carrying a quiet whisper that seemed less like sound and more like memory. And in that moment, Ethan realized that the silence he had once tried to escape had become something else entirely, something that held meaning instead of emptiness. Rex slowed slightly, turning his head toward the distance, not with tension, but with recognition, as if the journey ahead was not unknown to him, only unfinished, and Ethan followed that subtle shift, adjusting his direction, without hesitation, because trust had replaced doubt somewhere along the way. Behind them, the cabin stood still among the trees, its hidden space now open, its purpose fulfilled, no longer a place of waiting, but a place that had quietly done its part. Ahead, the path continued, stretching beyond what could be seen or measured, guided not by sight, but by something steadier, something that had moved through sound, through instinct, through time itself. And as Ethan walked forward with the dog, beside him, carrying a story he could not read, but somehow understood, one truth settled gently into the space between each step. Sometimes the world does not reveal its meaning all at once. Sometimes it gives it to those who keep walking, trusting that what they cannot see is already leading them exactly where they are meant to go.